The wind didn't just blow through the village of Oakhaven. It screamed, a high thin sound like a child losing their mind in a locked room. Arthur Penhaligon sat by the frosted window of his cottage, a glass of lukewarm scotch held in a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. Outside, the English countryside was being erased by a white shroud. This wasn't the picturesque snow of a Christmas card. It was heavy, wet, and suffocating, turning the familiar hills of the Peak District into a series of white, featureless mounds. The power had gone out 3 hours ago, leaving the village in a silence so profound it felt heavy, like dirt piled on a coffin lid. He thought about the old well in the garden, the one his late wife, Martha, had always told him to fill in. It was deep, medieval, and supposedly bottomless. As the snow drifted higher, he realized he could no longer see the stone lip of the well. It was just a hole in the white world now, a mouth waiting to be fed. He took a sip of the scotch and winced. The cold was beginning to settle into the floorboards, a creeping frost that felt less like weather and more like an invasion. The first story he remembered, the one that crawled out of his memory like a centipede, was about the Miller boy back in '84. Another heavy snow, another blackout. They found him 3 days later, not frozen, but tucked into the hollow of an oak tree, his eyes sewn shut with horsehair. No tracks leading to the tree, no signs of a struggle. Just a boy turned into a doll. Arthur shivered. The village didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about the things that lived in the high moors when the temperature dropped below zero and the sky turned the color of a bruised lung. Then there was the second tale, the one the old-timers whispered in the pub when the tourists weren't listening. This snow stitcher. They said it wasn't a man, but a collection of shadows that only gained form when it could wrap itself in the white. It didn't kill you, not at first. It just took your voice. You'd wake up in your bed, feeling the draft from an open window, and when you tried to scream, you'd find your mouth filled with freezing slush that tasted of copper and old earth. Arthur looked at the door. The heavy oak bolt was thrown, but it felt flimsy. The third story hit him then, a memory of his own father. His father had once told him that during the Great Frost of '62, he had seen figures standing in the middle of the frozen river Derwent. They weren't moving. They were just waiting, their arms outstretched like frozen weather veins. When the thaw finally came, the river didn't yield bodies. It yielded clothes. Empty suits, dresses, and children's coats, all perfectly preserved, but with no skin or bone inside them. The fourth story was closer to home. It was about the lady who lived in the manor on the hill, Lady Alara. She'd gone out to feed the birds in a flurry and never came back. When the search party finally broke down her door weeks later, they found the house was filled with snow, not because a window was broken, but because it was growing out of the carpets. It was white, crystalline, and it smelled of rotting lilies. They found her in the parlor, sitting in her favorite chair, turned into a sculpture of ice. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of absolute, ecstatic recognition. Arthur's fire was dying. He reached for a log, but his fingers brushed against something wet on the hearth. He looked down. A trail of melted slush led from the darkness of the kitchen into the living room. It wasn't a footprint. It was a drag mark, as if something heavy and soft had been pulled across the floor. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The fifth story, the one about the crawlspace king, was thumping in his chest. It was a local legend about a man who stayed in his house during a blizzard and realized the shadows in the corners were moving independently of the light. He had started hearing a wet, slapping sound coming from the walls, a sound like a heartbeat made of mud. He forced himself to look at the kitchen doorway. Nothing but the abyss. But he knew the sixth story, the story of the glass-eyed twins. Two children who appeared on doorsteps during the worst storms, asking for a cup of salt. If you gave it to them, they'd leave. If you didn't, they'd wait until you fell asleep and then pour salt into your eyes until you were as blind as the blizzard outside. He felt a sudden, itching burn in his tear ducts. The wind shrieked again, and this time, there was a thud against the cottage wall. It wasn't the wind. It was a physical strike. The seventh story, the knocker, a creature that imitated the sound of a loved one's heartbeat against the door. Martha. He thought of her cold, gray face in the casket. He thought of the way the earth had sounded hitting the lid. Thud, thud, thud. The sound came again, rhythmically, from the front door. He gripped the scotch glass so hard it snapped, the shards slicing deep into his palm. He didn't feel the pain. The cold had numbed him too far. The eighth story was the one he'd written himself, years ago, but never dared to publish. It was about a man who realized the snow wasn't falling from the sky, but rising from the ground, a white fungus of the earth, reclaiming the world of the living. In his story, the man looked in the mirror and saw his own skin turning to frost, his blood thickening into a slushy ice that ground against his veins like sandpaper. Arthur looked at his hand. The blood wasn't red. It was a pale, watery pink, and it was starting to crystallize on his skin. He heard a whisper then, not from the door, but from the well outside, drifting through the stone walls as if they were made of gauze. "Arthur, it's so warm down here." The ninth story, the well wife. A woman who falls into the dark and finds that the bottom isn't water, but a gateway to a place where the sun never shines and the air is made of silver needles. She comes back for her husband, but she doesn't bring love. She brings the hunger of the deep earth. The thudding at the door stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a predatory silence. Arthur stood up, his joints cracking like frozen branches. He walked toward the door, his feet heavy, leaving wet, dark prints on the rug. He reached for the bolt. He knew the 10th story. It was the one no one ever got to tell because it was the ending of all stories. It was the story of the Final Flake. The moment you realize that the storm isn't outside your house, it's inside your lungs. You breathe in the cold, and you realize you aren't a man anymore. You're just a pillar of salt and ice, a monument to a winter that will never end. He pulled the bolt back. The door swung open, not to the garden, but to a void of blinding, screaming white. A hand, pale and translucent as a fish's belly, reached out from the drift. It wasn't Martha's hand. It was something longer, with too many knuckles. It touched his cheek, and the skin there didn't just freeze, it shattered. Arthur didn't scream. He couldn't. His lungs were already full of snow. As he was pulled out into the white, the last thing he saw was the well, glowing with a faint, sickly blue light, and the realization that the village of Oakhaven wasn't on the map anymore. It had been swallowed whole, and the snow was still falling, hungry for the rest of the world. He felt his consciousness fragmenting, each piece a single snowflake falling into an endless, dark forest where the trees were made of bone and the wind only knew his name. The cottage door slammed shut, but there was no one left inside to hear it. The fire hissed out, leaving only a pile of gray ash that looked remarkably like human remains. Outside, the mounds of snow began to shift and stand, 100 white figures turning their faceless heads toward the next chimney smoke on the horizon. The long UK night had only just begun, and the frost was very, very patient. The sky over the fens of Lincolnshire wasn't black. It was a bruised, heavy purple that seemed to press down on the roof of the car until the metal groaned. Elias drove with his chin pressed nearly to the steering wheel, his eyes stinging from the hypnotic dance of the wipers. The snow here didn't fall, it attacked. It swirled in jagged, violent geometric patterns that defied the wind, coating the narrow A roads in a layer of treacherous, slick grease. He was miles from the nearest village, somewhere between the skeletal remains of old windmills and the drainage ditches that lined the flats like open veins. The heater in his old Volvo gave a final, wheezing rattle and died. Within minutes, the cabin air turned brittle. Elias pulled his coat tighter, feeling the first prickle of true, cold-blooded dread. He remembered the local warning, the one he'd laughed off at the pub in Crowland. "Mind the stitcher on the white nights, lad. He likes a man who's lost his way." He had assumed it was just more rural theater for the tourists, a bit of local flavor to sell bitter ale. But as the car's engine began to sputter, losing power as if something were drinking the fuel straight from the lines, the humor of the tale evaporated. The car shuddered and died. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy weight that seemed to pop his ears. Elias tried the ignition. Click, click. The battery was cold dead. He sat for a moment, the only sound being the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of the engine cooling. Then, a new sound emerged. It was a soft, wet sliding noise, like a heavy bolt of silk being dragged over frozen mud. It was coming from the roof of the car. He looked up. The interior light flickered once and died. In the sudden darkness, he saw the fabric of the car's ceiling sagging downward, as if something incredibly heavy and soft was resting directly above him. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the fabric, and it felt unnervingly cold, colder than the air outside. As his fingers brushed the lining, a thin, needle-like object poked through the material, missing his eye by an inch. It was silver, bone-white, and trailing a strand of something that looked like translucent, frozen sinew. Elias scrambled into the passenger seat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, through the frost-crusted windows, he saw a shape. It wasn't a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs articulated at impossible angles like a spider's legs. It was draped in a tattered, heavy cloak made of what looked like thousands of individual pieces of white cloth, all stitched together with that same glistening thread. But as the figure moved closer, Elias realized with a jolt of nausea that it wasn't cloth. It was skin. Pale, frost-bitten skin, stitched into a patchwork shroud that hummed in the wind. The thing, the stitcher, didn't have a face, only a mass of overlapping stitches where eyes and a mouth should be. It leaned down, its head pressing against the driver's side window. The glass began to crack, not from pressure, but from a sudden, intense drop in temperature. The frost spread across the pane in the shape of a hand, delicate and cruel. Elias fumbled for the door handle on the passenger side, praying the lock wasn't frozen. It gave way with a sickening crack of ice. He tumbled out into the knee-deep snow, the wind instantly stripping the breath from his lungs. He didn't run toward the road. He couldn't see the road. He ran toward the black silhouette of a derelict drainage station, his boots sinking into the muck beneath the snow. Behind him, he heard it. Snip, 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 the sound of massive shears cutting through the frozen air. He reached the station, a brick shell filled with rusted iron gears and the smell of ancient stagnant water. He huddled behind a massive cast iron pump, his breath coming in ragged, white plumes. He tried to stay silent, but the cold was a physical assault, making his teeth chatter with the sound. Like hailstones on a tin roof. A shadow fell over the doorway. The stitcher didn't walk. It drifted, its patchwork cloak trailing behind it like a wedding train made of nightmares. It began to hum, a low, discordant vibration that made Elias's vision blur. The creature held a long, curved needle made from a human ulna, threaded with the silver hair of the lost. "I can see the seams," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the creature's mouth, but from the air itself. "You're coming apart at the edges, Elias. Let me fix you. Let me make you whole." Elias backed away, his heel catching on a rusted pipe. He fell hard, his hand splashing into a pool of slushy water. He scrambled back, but the stitcher was already there, looming over him. The creature reached down, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with shards of ice. It gripped Elias's jaw with a strength that felt like a vice. "The silence is the best thread," the thing hissed. Elias tried to scream, but the creature's free hand moved with blinding, supernatural speed. He felt the sting of the bone needle piercing his upper lip, then the lower. He watched in paralyzed horror as the translucent thread was pulled taut. His mouth was being sewn shut, the stitches neat and agonizingly tight. He could feel the coldness of the thread entering his flesh, turning his blood to ice as it went. The stitcher leaned in close, its faceless head inches from his. "Don't worry," it vibrated. "I have so much more of you to mend. We'll start with the eyes next. You won't need to see the winter. You'll be the winter." Elias struggled, his muffled grunts vibrating against the fresh stitches, but the cold was winning. His limbs felt heavy, turning to the same gray, leaden weight as the Lincolnshire sky. As the creature began to work on his eyelids, threading the silver sinew through his lashes, Elias looked out the doorway one last time. The snow was falling peacefully now, covering his car, covering the road, erasing everything. He realized then that the cloth on the creature's cloak wasn't just skin, it was memories, faces, and names. And as the needle sank into his brow, he felt his own name drifting away, becoming just another stitch in the endless, white shroud of the fens. When the sun rose the next morning, a local farmer found the Volvo. It was empty, the driver's door wide open. There were no footprints leading away from the car, only a series of small, circular holes in the snow, as if a very tall, very thin tripod had walked toward the old pump house. Inside the station, they found nothing but a pile of salt and a single, rusted silver needle resting on a frozen pump. Elias was gone. But if you listen closely to the wind in Lincolnshire when the snow is thick, you can hear a rhythmic, muffled thumping. The sound of someone trying to scream through a mouth that has been permanently mended. The river Derwent didn't look like water anymore. It looked like a vein of black marble cut into the throat of the valley. It was the winter of 1962, the kind of winter that broke spirits and buried cattle where they stood. Thomas stood on the stone bridge, his breath rising in a thick, stagnant cloud. The air didn't just feel cold. It felt ancient, as if the plummeting temperature had thinned the veil between the present and something much older that lived beneath the grit and the shale. He was looking for his brother, Silas, who had gone out to check the sheep 3 hours ago and hadn't returned. The silence of the great frost was different from a normal snowstorm. It was a heavy, crystalline silence that made the sound of a snapping twig echo like a gunshot. Thomas called out his brother's name, but the sound seemed to be swallowed instantly by the white-furred trees. He climbed down the embankment, his boots crunching through a crust of ice that felt like breaking glass. As he reached the level of the frozen river, he stopped. There, in the middle of the ice, stood a figure. It was motionless, positioned perfectly in the center of the widest stretch of the Derwent. It looked like Silas, the same heavy wool coat, the same flat cap, but the posture was wrong. The figure was standing with its arms outstretched, palms facing upward, tilted slightly toward the moonless sky. Thomas felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with the wind. He stepped onto the ice. It was solid, thick enough to hold a tractor, yet it groaned under his weight with a deep, subterranean bass note. "Silas," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. As Thomas got closer, he noticed the frost. It wasn't just on the coat, it was growing out of it. Long, delicate needles of ice, 6 inches long, sprouted from the wool like the quills of a porcupine. They shimmered with a dull, internal light. Thomas reached out to touch his brother's shoulder, but as his hand drew near, he felt a repulsive force, a static hum that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Silas, man, look at me," he pleaded. He stepped around to face the figure and nearly lost his footing. It wasn't Silas. The coat was Silas's, yes, and the trousers and the boots. But the clothes were standing up on their own. The sleeves were puffed out as if filled by arms. The collar was turned up around a neck that wasn't there. There was no skin, no bone, no face. The cap hovered inches above an empty void. The clothes were rigid, frozen into a permanent, mocking statue of a human being. Thomas backed away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned to run back to the bank, but he stopped dead. Behind him, 50 yards downriver, there was another one. A woman's floral dress, stiff and wind-whipped, standing upright on the ice. Beside it, a child's Sunday suit, arms spread wide in that same ecstatic, terrifying gesture. Then another, and another. All along the curve of the Derwent, figures were appearing, empty shells of the village's inhabitants, standing like frozen sentinels on the black ice. He recognized them all. That was Mrs. Gaskell's heavy winter shawl. That was Old Man Miller's tweed jacket. They were all empty. A wet, cracking sound came from beneath his feet. He looked down and saw a hand, a real hand, blue-gray and shriveled, pressed against the underside of the clear ice. Then another hand joined it. Then a face. It was Silas. He was under the ice, his eyes wide and clouded with frost, his mouth open in a silent, watery plea. But he wasn't alone. Dozens of bodies were drifting just beneath the surface, stripped of their clothes, their bare skin looking like pale marble in the gloom. The river walkers didn't want the people, they wanted the shapes of them. Thomas watched in paralyzed horror as the empty suit of Silas began to move. It didn't walk, it glided, the boots scraping against the ice with a sound like a whetstone. The empty sleeves reached for Thomas. "The ice needs to wear you," a voice echoed, vibrating through the soles of his boots. It was the sound of grinding glaciers, of stones being crushed by the weight of time. Thomas turned and scrambled for the bank, his fingers clawing at the frozen mud. He could hear the rustle of the empty clothes behind him, the dry, rhythmic swish-swish of wool and cotton moving without flesh. He reached the top of the embankment and didn't stop running until he reached the village square. He pounded on doors, screamed for help, but no one answered. He looked through the window of the local bakery. Inside, The baker's apron was standing behind the counter, holding a rolling pin with empty strings. The baker himself was nowhere to be seen, likely already drifting in the dark, silent currents of the Derwent, stripped and forgotten. Thomas realized then that the frost hadn't come to kill them. It had come to harvest them. The people were the chaff, and their clothes, the things that defined them, the things that held their scent and their shape, were the grain. He looked down at his own hands and saw the frost beginning to bloom on his sleeves. The threads of his coat were starting to stiffen, the wool beginning to stand up on its own. He felt a sudden, violent tug at his collar. It wasn't a hand pulling him, it was the coat itself. It wanted to stand. It wanted to join the others on the river. He tried to unbutton it, but his fingers were too numb, and the buttons had already turned to ice, fused to the fabric. The coat tightened around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs, lifting his arms up into that wide, welcoming gesture. By morning, the sun broke over the valley, but it brought no warmth. A search party from the next town over found the village of Oakhaven eerily quiet. There wasn't a soul in the streets, but the river was full. Thousands of garments stood perfectly still on the ice, a silent, colorful congregation of the empty. And deep beneath the black surface of the Derwent, 1,000 pale bodies drifted in the current, finally free of the weight of their names, while their clothes stood guard above, waiting for the next great frost to bring them new company. Thomas was there, too, or at least his coat was. It stood on the bridge, arms open wide, catching the morning light in its icy quills, while Thomas himself became just another flash of white skin moving toward the sea. The manor on the hill, known to the locals as Blackwood Hall, didn't sit on the land so much as it loomed over it, a jagged tooth of Victorian Gothic architecture that seemed to attract the worst of the Peak District's weather. Lady Alara had lived there alone since the winter of '78, a woman as sharp and brittle as the icicles hanging from her eaves. She was a creature of habit, and her most sacred ritual was the afternoon feeding of the birds. Even as the blizzard of '92 rolled in, a storm that the Met Office described as a once-in-a-century anomaly, she donned her heavy furs and stepped out onto the terrace with a silver bowl of seed. She never returned to the warmth of her hearth. 3 weeks later, when the snow had settled enough for the village constable and a few stout men from the valley to trek up the private road, they found the manor's front doors standing wide open. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. But as they stepped into the grand foyer, the constable's lantern revealed something that defied the laws of nature. The house was filled with snow, but it hadn't blown in through the doors. It was growing. In the center of the Persian rug, a mound of white crystals pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. It didn't look like frozen water. It looked like a blossoming fungus, structured in delicate, fractal petals that climbed the legs of the mahogany tables and wove through the banisters. The air didn't smell of winter. It smelled of heavy, cloying lilies and wet earth. One of the men reached out to brush a clump of the growth from a portrait, and his finger came away not wet, but burned, a flash freeze so intense it turned his skin a charred, necrotic black instantly. "Don't touch the white," the constable warned, his voice trembling. They moved deeper into the house, following the trail of the bloom. It became thicker in the parlor. The floorboards were hidden beneath a foot of the stuff, which felt spongy and alive under their boots. It hissed as they moved, a sound like 1,000 tiny teeth grinding together. In the center of the room sat Lady Alara. She was in her high-backed wing chair, facing the dead fireplace. She looked like a masterpiece carved from diamond. The snow hadn't covered her, it had replaced her. It had sprouted from her pores, woven through her hair, and crystallized in her open eyes. Her skin was a translucent shell, and inside, they could see the white, floral frost moving through her veins like slow-motion lightning. Her expression was one of horrific beauty, her mouth frozen in a wide, silent O of absolute realization. Then, the constable noticed the bowl. The silver birdseed bowl was in her lap, but it wasn't seed inside. It was human teeth, small, white, and polished. A soft thump came from upstairs. Then another, the sound of something heavy and soft dropping onto the floorboards. The men looked up to see the ceiling sagging. The white growth was spreading through the plaster, the petals of the frost fungus beginning to drip down like slow, freezing honey. "The birds," a voice whispered. It was faint, high-pitched, and seemed to come from Lady Alara's frozen throat, though her lips didn't move. They were so hungry. They didn't want the seed. They wanted the warmth inside. From the shadows of the gallery above, the birds emerged. They weren't crows or sparrows. They were creatures made of the same white, crystalline growth, small, jagged things with wings like broken glass and beaks of sharpened ice. They didn't fly. They drifted on the drafts of the house, their bodies clicking and humming. Hundreds of them began to descend, attracted by the heat of the living men. The constable turned to run, but the floor had changed. The snow fungus had wrapped around his ankles, the cold sinking through his leather boots and fusing his bones to the wood. He screamed as he felt his blood begin to crystallize, the liquid in his joints turning to shards of ice. He looked at his hand and watched as a white, beautiful flower erupted from his palm, tearing through the flesh without a drop of blood. The other men didn't make it to the door. The birds swarmed them, not pecking, but simply touching them, each contact leaving a patch of spreading frost that consumed wool, skin, and muscle. The parlor became a garden of white statues, a gallery of men frozen in various stages of flight and agony. As the constable's vision began to cloud over with the creeping white bloom, he saw Lady Alara's statue tilt its head. The ice in her eyes shifted, focusing on him. "It's not a storm," she whispered, the sound vibrating through his very marrow. "It's a harvest. The earth is tired of being brown and wet. It wants to be pure. It wants to be glass." The manor on the hill fell silent again. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale palace, sparkling under the winter moon. But inside, the garden was growing. The snow continued to bloom from the carpets, the walls, and the mouths of the frozen guests, filling the rooms until the windows groaned under the pressure. When spring finally came to the valley, the snow on the hills melted, but the manor remained white. The sun didn't affect it. The rain didn't wash it away. And local legend says that if you stand near the gates on a quiet evening, you can hear the clicking of the glass birds and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a house that has finally become a tomb of perfect, eternal ice. The village of Blackwood was a place of low ceilings and high secrets, a cluster of stone cottages huddled together against the biting winds of the Yorkshire moors. Elias Thorne lived in the oldest of them, a squat building with foundations that predated the parish church. The blizzard had buried his front door by midnight, sealing him into a darkness that smelled of damp soot and old, cold stone. He wasn't bothered by the isolation. He was a man of books and silence. But as the temperature outside dropped to a lethal stillness, the house began to talk back. It started in the crawl space, the narrow, dirt-floored void beneath the living room floorboards. It was a space no more than 18 inches high, meant for pipes and cables, but tonight it sounded like a drum. Thump, thump, thump. It was a slow, wet sound, like a heavy sack of meat being dropped onto mud. Elias sat in his armchair, his flashlight beam cutting a yellow hole in the gloom. He tried to tell himself it was the house settling under the weight of the snow, but the rhythm was too deliberate. It was a heartbeat. He knelt and pressed his ear to the floorboards. The wood was freezing, but beneath it, he felt a vibration. It wasn't mechanical. It felt organic, a low-frequency thrum that made his own pulse try to sync with the floor. The story of the crawl-space king was a bit of local filth that mothers used to keep children from playing in the cellars. They said a man had hidden there during a plague centuries ago, feeding on the rats and the rising damp until he forgot how to be a man. They said he'd grown flat and pale, his bones softening like wet cardboard until he could slide through the gaps in the masonry like a tongue through teeth. Elias gripped his flashlight. "Who's there?" he called out. The thumping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a soft, sliding sound began. It moved from the center of the room toward the corner, right where the old radiator pipe disappeared, into the floor. The gap around the pipe was barely 2 inches wide. Elias watched, his breath hitching, as a pale, translucent fluid began to bubble up from the hole. It wasn't water. It was thick, like tallow, and it smelled of ancient, stagnant caves. Suddenly, a finger emerged. It didn't have a nail. It was long, white, and looked like it was made of peeled ginger. It was followed by another, and then a hand that looked like it had been run through a pasta press, flat, wide, and horribly flexible. The hand gripped the floorboard and pulled. The wood didn't snap. It groaned as if the creature beneath was exerting a pressure that defied physics. Elias scrambled back, hitting his head against the mantelpiece. He watched in a trance of pure, crystalline terror as a head began to squeeze through the 2-inch gap. The skull must have been liquid, the way it elongated and poured through the opening. First the crown, bald and wet. Then the eyes, large, milky orbs with no lids, staring at him with a vacuum-like hunger. There was no nose, just 2 slits that whistled as the creature inhaled the warm air of the room. The crawlspace king didn't stand up once it was through. It couldn't. It remained flat, a living rug of pale, quivering flesh that rippled across the floor toward him. It moved with a sickening, undulating motion, its joints clicking like a bag of marbles. So much room. Up here, the thing hissed. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It seemed to vibrate out of the creature's very skin. Elias grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and swung it with everything he had. The iron sank into the creature's shoulder with a wet thud, but there was no blood. The wound simply closed around the poker, the flesh sucking the metal in like quicksand. The creature didn't flinch. It just kept coming, sliding over his boots, its weight surprisingly heavy, like a lead blanket. "I need a new suit," it whispered. "The earth is too tight. Your skin, it looks so spacious." Elias tried to scream, but the creature surged upward, its flat, wide body wrapping around his legs and chest. It was cold, so cold it felt like being bathed in liquid nitrogen. He felt his ribs begin to creak as the creature squeezed, its boneless limbs searching for his mouth, his ears, his nose. It wasn't trying to kill him, it was trying to get inside him. It wanted to use his skeleton as a frame, to fill the empty spaces of his body with its own formless mass. He fell to the floor, the flashlight rolling away and casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. In the flickering light, he saw the creature's face press against his own. The milky eyes were inches from his. He felt a wet, flat tongue slide across his cheek, tasting the salt of his fear. "Don't worry," the king hissed, its body already beginning to slide down Elias's throat, stretching his jaw to a breaking point. "I'll take very good care of your bones." Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the cottage until it was just a white mound in the dark. Inside, the thumping returned. Thump, thump, thump. But it wasn't coming from the crawl space anymore. It was coming from Elias's chest. When the thaw finally came in April, the villagers found the house in perfect order. Elias was sitting in his armchair, a book in his lap. He looked healthy, sturdier, even. But when the postman spoke to him, Elias didn't turn his head. He just stared forward with milky, lidless eyes, and his voice sounded like wet gravel grinding at the bottom of a well. And sometimes, when the house got very quiet, the neighbors could hear a soft, wet sliding sound coming from behind his skin, as if something flat and heavy was trying to find a way back down into the dark. The storm that hit the Cotswolds that Tuesday didn't just bring snow. It brought a blindness so absolute that the stone walls of the villages seemed to dissolve into the white. In the hamlet of Thornfield, the street lamps flickered and died, leaving only the guttering orange glow of wood fires behind frosted panes. Thomas, a retired schoolmaster with a penchant for solitude, was finishing a bowl of soup when the knocking started. It wasn't a heavy thud, but a sharp, rhythmic tapping, clink, 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 like a ring against glass. He opened the door to a blast of freezing air that nearly knocked him back. Standing on the porch were 2 children, a boy and a girl, no older than 7. They wore thin, Victorian-style nightgowns that should have been fluttering in the gale, but they hung perfectly still, as if weighted with lead. Their skin was the color of a drowned man's belly, and their hair was white, not from age, but from a dusting of fine, crystalline frost. "Please, sir," the girl said, her voice a flat, hollow monotone. "May we have a cup of salt? The fire is out, and the hearth is cold." Thomas stared at them, his heart skipping. "Children, come in. You'll freeze out there. Where are your parents?" They didn't move. They stood perfectly aligned, their hands tucked behind their backs. It was then that Thomas looked at their eyes. They weren't eyes at all. In each socket sat a perfectly round marble of clouded glass, etched with faint, hairline fractures. There were no pupils, no irises, just a milky, reflective surface that mirrored the storm behind him. "Just the salt, sir," the boy said, his head tilting at an angle that should have snapped his neck. "The white needs the white." Thomas felt a primal, shivering instinct scream at him to shut the door. But the sight of them, so small and frail against the biting UK winter, tugged at his conscience. "Wait here," he muttered, turning toward the kitchen. He grabbed a ceramic mug and filled it to the brim with coarse sea salt. His hands were shaking so violently that grains spilled across the linoleum, clicking like insects. When he returned to the door, the children had stepped closer. They were now inches from the threshold, the air around them smelling of ozone and old, stagnant pond water. "Here," Thomas said, thrusting the mug toward the girl. She reached out. Her fingers were long, blue-tinted, and felt like dry parchment. As she took the mug, the boy leaned forward, his glass eyes catching the faint light of the fireplace. "You didn't offer enough," he whispered. I gave you a full cup," Thomas stammered. "The salt is for the ground," the girl said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating in Thomas's chest. "But our eyes are thirsty. They haven't tasted the sting in 100 winters." Before Thomas could react, the boy's hand shot out, his fingers pinning Thomas's head against the doorframe with the strength of a hydraulic press. The girl didn't spill the mug. She tipped it, but the salt didn't fall to the ground. It levitated, a swirling cloud of white crystals dancing in the air between them. "The salt keeps the meat from rotting," the boy hissed, his glass eyes beginning to spin in their sockets. "But it makes the spirit bright." Thomas tried to scream, but the girl pressed a frozen palm over his mouth. Her skin tasted of copper and rime. He watched in a trance of pure agony as the cloud of salt began to funnel toward his face. It didn't go into his mouth or nose. It headed for his eyes. He felt the first grain hit his cornea, a sharp, searing burn like a needle of fire. Then 100 more, then 1,000. The salt began to abrasive the surface of his eyes, grinding into the soft tissue, drinking the moisture until his sockets felt like they were being filled with hot coals. He could hear the wet, crunching sound of his own membranes being shredded by the coarse crystals. "Beautiful," the girl whispered. As the salt packed into his eyes, he felt a strange, cold pressure. The children weren't just blinding him, they were replacing him. He felt his own eyes being pushed back into his skull, the optic nerves snapping with a sound like dry twigs. In their place, he felt two hard, cold spheres being pressed in. Glass. The pain reached a crescendo and then went numb. The world didn't go dark, it went white. A brilliant, crystalline white that showed him things no living man should see. He saw the village not as stone and wood, but as a graveyard of frozen souls, each one with a thin, silver thread connecting them to the moon. The children let go. Thomas slumped against the wall, his hands clawing at his face. But when he pulled his fingers away, there was no blood, only a fine, white powder. "Thank you, sir," the boy said. "Now you can see the storm the way we do." Thomas looked up. He didn't see the children anymore. He saw two pillars of swirling snow that vaguely resembled human shapes. He looked at his hands and saw that his skin was turning the color of milk. He walked to the hallway mirror, his movements stiff and clicking. He peered into the glass. Two marbles of clouded, fractured glass stared back at him. He tried to cry, but no tears came. Instead, a fine trickle of salt leaked from his lower lids, spilling down his cheeks and hitting the floor with a soft, rhythmic clink, clink, clink. Outside, the knocking began at the next house down the lane. Thomas stood by his window, his glass eyes fixed on the white void. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel anything. He just felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go into the kitchen and find more salt. After all, the winter was long, and his new eyes were so very thirsty. The village of Kettlewell was buried under a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. The blizzard had moved in from the North Sea with a predatory swiftness, cutting off the phone lines and turning the winding Yorkshire lanes into impassable trenches of white. Inside his isolated cottage, Arthur sat by a fire that seemed to give off more shadows than heat. It had been exactly 1 year since he had buried his wife, Martha, in the frozen earth of the parish churchyard. The grief was a dull ache, but tonight, the cold made it sharp. He was nursing a glass of dark rum when the first sound came. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creak of the rafters. Thump thump. It was a soft, rhythmic double beat against the heavy oak of the front door. Arthur froze, the glass pausing halfway to his lips. He waited, his heart mimicking the rhythm. Thump thump. It was the exact cadence of a human heart. Not a knock, not the sharp, impatient rap of a neighbor or a traveler lost in the storm, but the wet, internal thud of a muscle pushing blood. Arthur stood up, his joints protesting. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the vaulted room. No answer came, only the whistling of the wind through the keyhole. He moved to the door and peered through the small, iron-grated viewing port. He saw nothing but the swirling white chaos of the gale. He was about to turn away when the sound came again, but this time, it wasn't on the door. It was against the stone wall, right next to his ear. Thump thump. The vibration was so strong he could feel it in his teeth. He pressed his palm against the cold stone, and for a second, the wall felt soft. It felt like skin. He remembered the old folklore Martha used to mention, the knocker. In the Dales, they whispered that if a grief was deep enough and the winter cold enough, the ground would try to return what it took. But the earth didn't have a memory for faces or souls. It only remembered the pulse. It would send a knocker to the door, a thing made of compressed soil and frozen roots that could mimic the heartbeat of the person you missed the most. "Arthur, let me in. It's so cold." The voice didn't come from outside. It sounded as if it were vibrating through the floorboards, rising up through the soles of his feet. It was Martha's voice, but it was wrong. It had a wet, granular quality to it, as if her lungs were filled with silt and worms. "You're not her," Arthur whispered, backing away toward the kitchen. "Martha's gone." Thump thump, thump thump. The knocking was everywhere now. It was on the windows, the ceiling, the floor. The house was being surrounded by a rhythmic, organic drumming. He watched in horror as the heavy wooden door began to bow inward. Small, dark clumps of earth began to squeeze through the cracks in the doorframe. They weren't just dirt. They were moving, twisting like tiny, black fingers. A pale shape appeared at the window. It wasn't a face, but a mass of white roots and gray mud molded into the suggestion of a woman's features. Two hollow pits served as eyes, and within them, Arthur saw the glint of something wet and ancient. The thing pressed its chest against the glass, and the glass didn't break. It began to pulse. "I can feel your heart, Arthur." The voice vibrated. "It's so loud, so warm. Mine stopped in the dark, and it's so very quiet down there." The door didn't burst, it simply dissolved. The oak turned into soft, rotting mulch in an instant, and the knocker stepped through the threshold. It was a towering figure of wet earth and tangled briars, draped in the tattered, mud-stained remains of the dress Martha had been buried in. As it moved, it left a trail of grave dirt and melting ice on the rug. Arthur scrambled back, his hand catching on a heavy kitchen knife. He lashed out, burying the blade in the creature's shoulder. There was no resistance, no blood. The knife sank into the muck with a squelching sound, and the wound instantly sealed around the metal, absorbing it. The creature reached out with a hand that felt like wet, freezing clay. It gripped Arthur's wrist, and he felt the cold sink straight to his bone, turning his marrow to slush. "Don't be afraid," the thing hissed, the sound like the shuffling of dead leaves. "I just want to sync the rhythm." It pulled him close, pressing its featureless chest against his. Arthur's heart was racing, a frantic, panic tattoo. The knocker's heart, a hard, frozen stone buried deep within its mud chest, began to beat in response. Thump thump. Arthur felt his own heart begin to slow. It was being forced to match the heavy, sluggish pace of the creature. Every time the knocker's stone heart thudded, Arthur felt a wave of icy lethargy wash over him. His vision began to fade at the edges, the room turning the color of wet peat. "There," the creature whispered, its voice now almost a perfect match for Martha's. "Now we beat as one." Arthur's legs gave out. He fell into the embrace of the mud and the roots. He felt the creature beginning to grow over him, the wet earth filling his mouth, his ears, his eyes. He wasn't being eaten. He was being buried alive inside a body that was already a grave. As the last of his warmth was sucked into the cold stone heart of the knocker, the drumming in the house finally stopped. The silence returned to Kettlewell, deeper and heavier than before. When the sun rose, the cottage was empty. The front door was gone, replaced by a wall of perfectly packed, frozen earth. There were no tracks in the snow leading away, only a single, heart-shaped stone resting on the pillow of Arthur's unmade bed. If you were to pick it up and hold it to your ear, you wouldn't hear a hum or a whistle. You would hear two hearts, beating slow and wet, forever trapped in the rhythm of the cold, dark ground. The sky over the village of Bleaklow was a flat, dead gray, but the air was oddly clear. There were no clouds to account for the white blanket that had begun to consume the valley. Arthur, a man who had spent his life writing about the things that go bump in the night, stood on his porch and watched the ground. He had noticed it 3 days ago, a small patch of white in the shadow of the old stone wall. It didn't melt when he poured hot water on it. It didn't crunch like ice. It was soft, fibrous, and it felt like it was breathing. By the 4th day, the snow was 6 inches deep, but it hadn't fallen from the heavens. Arthur had sat up all night with a flashlight, watching the garden. He had seen the white filaments rise like ghost hair from between the blades of grass. It was a subterranean eruption, a prehistoric fungus that had been triggered by the record-breaking drop in temperature. The UK wasn't being buried by weather. It was being reclaimed by the Earth's own pale rot. He called it the Great Rising in his notes. The local news was still reporting it as a freak blizzard, advising people to stay indoors and wait for the plows. But Arthur knew the plows wouldn't come. The plows would be stuck in a substance that gummed up engines and ate through rubber like acid. He walked into his kitchen and looked at the sink. A cluster of white, needle-like spores was growing from the drain. They reached upward, sensing the heat of his body. He felt a strange, tingling itch on the back of his hand. When he looked down, his heart stopped. A single white filament, no thicker than a thread of silk, was growing out of a pore on his knuckle. He grabbed a pair of tweezers and pulled. It didn't come out, it stretched. He felt a sharp, internal tug in his wrist, as if the thread were anchored to his tendons. He screamed and grabbed a kitchen knife, hacking at the thread until it snapped. Instead of blood, a thick, milky sap oozed from the wound. It was cold, so cold his hand went numb instantly. He realized then that the snow outside wasn't just covering the world, it was looking for a host. The fungus needed warmth to sporulate, and the village of Bleaklow was a giant incubator. He ran to the window. In the house across the lane, he saw Mrs. Higgins. She was standing perfectly still in her garden, the white growth already up to her waist. She wasn't struggling. She looked peaceful, her arms spread wide as the filaments wove through her clothes, stitching her to the ground. As Arthur watched, a burst of white dust erupted from her mouth, a cloud of spores that drifted toward his own house. He scrambled to shut the vents, to tape the windows, but he was too late. He could hear it now, a soft, rhythmic hissing coming from the walls. The fungus was inside the drywall, feeding on the insulation, spreading through the floorboards. The itch on his hand spread to his arm, then his chest. He stripped off his shirt and looked in the mirror. His skin was becoming a topographical map of white veins. They were beautiful, in a horrific way. Intricate, fractal patterns that shimmered with a pale, bioluminescent light. He could feel his blood thickening, turning into a slow-moving slush that ground against his heart. "It's not a death," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. It wasn't his own voice. It was a collective hum, the sound of a million spores vibrating in unison. "It's a refinement. The flesh is loud and messy. The white is silent. The white is one." He tried to reach for the phone, but his fingers wouldn't bend. They were becoming rigid, turning into stalks of the pale growth. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor. The floor felt soft now. The filaments were rising from the wood, welcoming him, weaving into his trousers, merging with his skin. He looked at his typewriter on the desk. He had wanted to write the greatest horror story of all time. He realized now that he was living it, but there would be no one left to read it. The entire island of Britain was being turned into a silent, white forest of human statues. He felt the first filament tickle the back of his throat. He opened his mouth to gasp for air, and the white growth surged in, tasting of winter and old, forgotten graves. It filled his lungs, not with fluid, but with a dry, airy lightness. His vision began to cloud over. The room didn't go dark, it became a brilliant, blinding white. As the last of his human consciousness flickered out, Arthur felt a strange sense of pride. He had finally written a story that no one could top. He was the paper, He was the ink, and the winter was the hand that wrote the end. Outside, the village of Bleak Low was gone. There were only mounds of white silk, swaying gently in a wind that no longer carried the sound of a single human heartbeat. The great rising had reached the sea, and the white hair was already beginning to stretch across the waves, searching for the next warm shore. The sky over the village of Bleak Low was a flat, dead gray, but the air was oddly clear. There were no clouds to account for the white blanket that had begun to consume the valley. Arthur, a man who had spent his life writing about the things that go bump in the night, stood on his porch and watched the ground. He had noticed it 3 days ago, a small patch of white in the shadow of the old stone wall. It didn't melt when he poured hot water on it. It didn't crunch like ice. It was soft, fibrous, and it felt like it was breathing. By the 4th day, the snow was 6 inches deep, but it hadn't fallen from the heavens. Arthur had sat up all night with a flashlight, watching the garden. He had seen the white filaments rise like ghost hair from between the blades of grass. It was a subterranean eruption, a prehistoric fungus that had been triggered by the record-breaking drop in temperature. The UK wasn't being buried by weather. It was being reclaimed by the Earth's own pale rot. He called it the Great Rising in his notes. The local news was still reporting it as a freak blizzard, advising people to stay indoors and wait for the plows. But Arthur knew the plows wouldn't come. The plows would be stuck in a substance that gummed up engines and ate through rubber like acid. He walked into his kitchen and looked at the sink. A cluster of white, needle-like spores was growing from the drain. They reached upward, sensing the heat of his body. He felt a strange, tingling itch on the back of his hand. When he looked down, his heart stopped. A single white filament, no thicker than a thread of silk, was growing out of a pore on his knuckle. He grabbed a pair of tweezers and pulled. It didn't come out, it stretched. He felt a sharp, internal tug in his wrist, as if the thread were anchored to his tendons. He screamed and grabbed a kitchen knife, hacking at the thread until it snapped. Instead of blood, a thick, milky sap oozed from the wound. It was cold, so cold his hand went numb instantly. He realized then that the snow outside wasn't just covering the world, it was looking for a host. The fungus needed warmth to sporulate, and the village of Bleak Low was a giant incubator. He ran to the window. In the house across the lane, he saw Mrs. Higgins. She was standing perfectly still in her garden, the white growth already up to her waist. She wasn't struggling. She looked peaceful, her arms spread wide as the filaments wove through her clothes, stitching her to the ground. As Arthur watched, a burst of white dust erupted from her mouth, a cloud of spores that drifted toward his own house. He scrambled to shut the vents, to tape the windows, but he was too late. He could hear it now, a soft, rhythmic hissing coming from the walls. The fungus was inside the drywall, feeding on the insulation, spreading through the floorboards. The itch on his hand spread to his arm, then his chest. He stripped off his shirt and looked in the mirror. His skin was becoming a topographical map of white veins. They were beautiful, in a horrific way. Intricate, fractal patterns that shimmered with a pale, bioluminescent light. He could feel his blood thickening, turning into a slow-moving slush that ground against his heart. "It's not a death," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. It wasn't his own voice. It was a collective hum, the sound of a million spores vibrating in unison. "It's a refinement. The flesh is loud and messy. The white is silent. The white is one." He tried to reach for the phone, but his fingers wouldn't bend. They were becoming rigid, turning into stalks of the pale growth. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor. The floor felt soft now. The filaments were rising from the wood, welcoming him, weaving into his trousers, merging with his skin. He looked at his typewriter on the desk. He had wanted to write the greatest horror story of all time. He realized now that he was living it, but there would be no one left to read it. The entire island of Britain was being turned into a silent, white forest of human statues. He felt the first filament tickle the back of his throat. He opened his mouth to gasp for air, and the white growth surged in, tasting of winter and old, forgotten graves. It filled his lungs, not with fluid, but with a dry, airy lightness. His vision began to cloud over. The room didn't go dark, it became a brilliant, blinding white. As the last of his human consciousness flickered out, Arthur felt a strange sense of pride. He had finally written a story that no one could top. He was the paper, he was the ink, and the winter was the hand that wrote the end. Outside, the village of Bleak Low was gone. There were only mounds of white silk, swaying gently in a wind that no longer carried the sound of a single human heartbeat. The great rising had reached the sea, and the white hair was already beginning to stretch across the waves, searching for the next warm shore. The sky over the Pennines didn't hold any more stars. It held a void so heavy it felt as if the atmosphere itself had frozen and was waiting to shatter. Elias sat in the middle of his kitchen, the floorboards stripped bare, his last candle guttering in a saucer of its own melted fat. He wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. He had lived through the first 9 stories, the stitcher, the well wife, the empty clothes on the Derwent, and he knew that there was no passing anymore. The UK was no longer a country. It was a white lung, and the breath of the world was turning to crystal. The Final Flake was a myth among the mountain rescues, a bit of gallows humor told over radios that eventually went silent. They said that in every great, world-ending blizzard, there is one specific flake of snow that carries the collective weight of the freeze. It doesn't fall like the others. It seeks. Elias watched the frost on his window. It was growing in the shape of rib cages. He felt a strange, light pressure in his chest, a sensation of dry, airy emptiness. He leaned forward and coughed. A single, perfect snowflake drifted out of his mouth and hovered in the air. It didn't fall to the floor. It glowed with a faint, ultraviolet light, spinning with a low, hum-like vibration that made the glass on the shelves shatter in unison. This was the 10th story, the one that didn't need a monster or a ghost, because the world itself had become the predator. He heard the sound of the village dying. It wasn't the sound of screaming. It was the sound of millions of tiny, crystalline snaps. The trees were exploding from the inside as their sap turned to ice. The houses were groaning as the nails were pushed out of the wood by the expanding frost. Elias looked at his own reflection in the darkened window. He could see his bones through his skin. They were glowing. His marrow was being replaced by the same white, humming light as the flake. "It's time to be still," a voice said. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the center of his brain, a cold, clear thought that felt like a diamond needle. He walked to the door and opened it. The world outside was gone. There was no ground, no sky, only a swirling, vertical sea of white. The temperature was so low that the air had turned to a liquid mist. Elias stepped out, but he didn't sink. The snow was so dense, so packed with the frozen souls of everyone who had come before, that he walked on top of it as if it were granite. In the distance, he saw them. Thousands of people, standing perfectly still in the white void. They were the people from the other stories. He saw Lady Alara, her skin now a lattice of glass. He saw the miller boy, his eyes still sewn shut, but weeping trails of silver light. They were all facing the same direction, toward the north, where a single, colossal pillar of ice pierced the clouds. The final flake drifted toward him. It touched his forehead, and the world didn't go black. It went white, a brilliant, blinding, absolute white that erased the concept of Elias. He felt his memories being sorted, frozen, and filed away into the great, cold library of the storm. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a monument. He was the 10th story, the period at the end of the sentence of humanity. He took his place in the line. His arms drifted up into that familiar, wide gesture, palms to the sky. He felt the frost weave through his heart, stopping the beat not with pain, but with a sudden, overwhelming sense of logic. Why move? Why breathe? The ice was perfect. The ice was forever. As the last flicker of his consciousness faded, he saw the final flake rise back into the sky, joining a billion others. The storm wasn't ending. It was just getting started. The island of Britain was now a silent, white tooth in the jaw of a hungry universe, and the only sound left was the beautiful, terrifying hum of the frost.